draft physics video. This one on the subject of the strong force. The traditionally talked about force that is doing this bizarre thing of forcing the protons to get closer to each other than should be physically possible because of their repulsive force. And I really hadn't thought about it. I had thought about it in the terms of the electrons. This idea of what the implications are of this pressure relief kind of valve that's created by two monopoles that are in the proximity of becoming a dipole, which essentially defines what many atoms become, many shapes, in the sense that there's many materials that can become magnetic. They're ferrous or temporarily paramagnetic. Copper, aluminum, lots of conductors fall into that category. Not very magnetic, but they can be magnetic when they're carrying current. So the strong force traditionally is not really explained in the sense that it's this mysterious force that is somehow breaking, overcoming the tremendous repulsive force that exists between protons and protons. So I guess I might as well just do the drawing thing. So I probably should have drawn it ahead of time, but certain inefficiencies in the way things work here. So let's put an electron in a scenario with two protons, and you'll see what I'm talking about fairly quickly. So I've talked about the fact that the force has these two polarized elements, and you can call them like proton quanta and electron quanta. So the field energy is composed of those two types, those two polarizations. And the proton and electron just act like filters. They just change in terms of, they create a change in terms of when something interacts with them. They treat the red ones different than they treat the black ones, so to speak. Their own kind versus the other kind. And by doing that, filter the two types of energy. So a stream coming in that has mixture hits a proton, the reds go out sideways, the blacks reflect, that kind of idea. Or they create a momentum in a direction. So traditionally, this scenario here, where you have two protons, now they hate each other in the sense that if this electron isn't here, I probably should have drawn it without the electron, obviously, the red force would just bounce back and forth. It would just keep reflecting. So the closer you bring them, the faster it reflects, the more pressure created. And so that's the force that the strong force is overcoming. But the irony is you don't need any strong force to overcome it. You just need this little thing in the middle. Because now when the red force comes into the electron, the red force leaves in one of the perpendicular dimensions, the two perpendicular dimensions, and so there's four ways it could leave. I'll draw that as best I can. And so there's no possibility of a continuing reflection. No reds can get trapped between the protons. And because the protons emit the black in the perpendicular dimension, obviously there could be no tension between the electron and the proton. No reflections can build up, so they're attractive. So now you've essentially made two protons that were hostile, and you've completely neutralized their hostility, destroyed any you can see that, I think. Any pressure problem is now eliminated. And so it's not really a strong force, it just really comes down to having an electron between the protons. Now the irony here is that neutrons are essentially thought of as being the combination of an electron and a proton in close proximity, combined in a way. And obviously that would be quite possible in this theory because of the reduced pressure, so these two can get very close to each other, and that's what we traditionally call a neutron. Now if you really look at that, a proton and an electron with, say, a neutron would be a hydrogen atom. So to make a hydrogen atom, you just need one of these plus another proton and then plus another electron. And this electron, these two would be in line, and this extra electron can be free. I mean, he's not between the two protons. So a hydrogen atom is really two protons and two electrons. And that could be the basis. This hydrogen nucleus could essentially be the basis, what we think of as the hydrogen nucleus, for the neutron, all the other atoms. So that sort of goes to the thing, like even when I was a kid and you heard about alchemy, and there was always a desire on my part anyway, I don't know whether you had the same kind of tendency, but there was sort of a feeling that everything should be made out of the previous stuff. So the periodic table was definitely a kind of thing where you kind of thought the earlier bits just added another bit and became some kind of new kind of matter. And so the new bit being added would be this, what is traditionally described almost as a hydrogen atom, but it's not really because it doesn't have this would be the atom, this whole thing, by definition. But you can have hydrogen informs ions that are missing this electron, and they would be double proton atoms then, usually thought of as proton and neutron. So it's the kind of strange animal is the neutron. The electron and proton are definitely the more certain elements in conventional physics because they're the charged elements. And the idea of the neutron, again, it was kind of left it didn't have an established function. There was no diagram of its function in terms of mitigating or creating this strong force. And so the irony is it's not really a force, it's a filter, and it's in the right place, which lets what we thought was the unsurmountable hatred that protons have for each other, that hatred or that repulsion is completely negatable by just simply putting an electron between the two of them. So all atoms are sort of based on, more complex atoms are based on these arrangements. The protons are arranged with ones that have the electron between them. We call it a neutron, so we don't count that electron, but that electron is there, and its service is in negating the strong force, the repulsive force between the protons. So now it makes sense that protons could be very close together in the nucleus of an atom because the electron is expelling the extra force. And yeah, so more complex atoms are just based on that same model. So in a sense it satisfies what I kind of thought as just observing physics in my youth, the idea that it's elemental and that there have to be elements that are doing something, and they have to be built out of the previous version, like an evolution almost, that the periodic table is just an evolution of arrangements of these elements, and they're all made out of the same elements. So yeah, so it's another big plus for this concept, for this conceptual view of physics that turns these that turns the forces into an actual particle and that moves between these more elaborate material bits of the proton and the electron, and it now satisfies another condition that exists that we observe in the world perfectly, in the sense that it explains one of the most mysterious forces in physics, the strong nuclear force, as not even a force, and as just a negation of repulsion. Likewise, the same would work for electrons, as I did point out in a previous video, that two electrons that are on opposite sides of a proton would be able to be much closer to the proton because of the fact that they are opposite each other. So anytime you have anytime there's a configuration of the atomic structure of an atom where there are more than two electrons in what is called an energy level, the more of those electrons that are in patterns like this, where they are opposite each other, the more likely it is to be that that atom will end up being small, much smaller than some other atom. And that would also explain on the periodic table why very light materials are mixed in with very heavy materials, in the sense that you add one more electron and proton and you end up a neutron, and the next element ends up being much heavier than the previous element, which was never very intuitive logically. Something seemed amiss that's the way the periodic table would work, but this sort of explains it, in the sense that it really has to do with how they're arranged, because if they're arranged not opposite each other, then the effect will be quite different in terms of the fact that you'll negate some force, but then you have the problem of the electrons not liking each other this way. So they're always going to tend to want to get further apart from each other, so there has to be some other electron in the way. And then you end up with a third electron. And in this arrangement, the problem would be that one part of the perpendicular is going to be 1/4 of the perpendicular will end up hitting the other electron, which means this electron theoretically wouldn't be able to get as close as these two. These two are going to get the closest to the proton, and the third one can't get as close because these two are going to be relieving the pressure in 1/4 of the time in the direction of this electron. But that's getting more complicated than I want to in this video, so just a short video, shorter, less long, just to say that I hadn't thought of it before, but yeah, the strong force is explainable now. Neutrons are explainable, and you know, along with the other stuff, magnetism, time dilation. So for a nonsense theory that some people are calling it, it does seem curious that such a simple mechanism could explain so many of these observed phenomena that have remained mysterious for decades, if not hundreds of years. So put that in your peep and smoke it and such. Yeah, so enough. I'll do comments and get snarky later. Trying to keep these polite and short, to the point. So this is for the message board on the subject of the strong force. Thank you very much.